Good afternoon. I'm Bob Gordon, and this is about my idiosyncratic way of doing database development stuff. And I'm with Salud Systems, and apparently what we do is industrial safety. We have currently a running application with several clients that tests for respirator screening. If you have to wear a respirator while you're coding, you have to be medically certified that it's safe to wear a respirator while you're coding. This is an OSHA rule. And the example I always use, if you're knee-deep in a toxic subroutine and you have asthma, you won't be able to use your inhaler with the respirator on. And that's a medical thing. What we're working on right now is a project for lockout tagout, and we'll look at a little teeny bit of that later. There's an iPad app. Lockout tagout, if you don't know, if you have a big machine that stamps car doors, somebody operates it and somebody else goes in and cleans it or changes the tooling, and that person doesn't want the operator to turn it on while he or she is in the machine. It's very bad results. And so that technician is supposed to take a padlock and put the padlock on the switch to turn it on or off and put the lock in the pocket, so it's safe. And there's supposed to be, according to OSHA, a procedure near the machine that describes the process of locking it down. And so we're writing software to facilitate making those procedures. And this is an homage to Bob Keeney. I had this written before his talk, but he agrees with me. Basically, we're in the business of not trying to do a lot. We're trying to be productive. And all right, aspirational version. Anyway, so that's the motivation for all of this. And what we have in a typical database application is users want to be able to enter data, find things, maybe make some reports, and not have to think about it. I mean, they don't want to think about this stuff either. Everyone wants to be as productive as they can. And so we make database applications, and they have stuff on the screen that the user can interact with, enter data of various kinds. And Xojo has all these nifty controls that you can use. Checkboxes and radio buttons and segment controls and pop-up menus and text fields. The problem, from what I was thinking about, is these all have different kind of natural values. For example, a checkbox is a Boolean if you ask what its value is. And radio buttons and segmented controls, if you ask what their value is, they give you back a number. And so do pop-up menus. Text fields give you text fields, text, strings. I've been using text because it's the more generic. We're not talking about text as the data type that's on iOS that someday should be replaced. At any rate, the insight I had was, let us make all the controls return strings or text. We make all the controls look exactly the same. Just hold that thought. What do we store in our databases? My bias is, if you can't do arithmetic on it, you store it as text. That's the rule. Yep, that's it. And I think that's all we have to say there. And it may take up a little more room, but maybe not. And we just heard another talk earlier today that space didn't matter, so okay. Also, who's using your application for the first 6 months or so? It's you and your testers. And if you're looking at the data in your table using a database tool, are you going to remember what 3 is? I don't. So I make up little brief things that I can actually read. And it's still text. And Booleans are to be discouraged. And there's a couple of reasons. Sometimes databases store them differently if you ever have to move to a different kind of database engine. Also, as soon as you store a Boolean, your client, somebody is going to come up with a third case. It's guaranteed. Example, in Minnesota, we have things called driver's licenses, and they indicate your sex, MF, and as of this year, other. So there's your evidence. Okay, so everything on the screen is text. If we make all the controls deal with text, we can simply do a control set value, and we don't care what the control is, and we can do get value from a control, and it always returns a string, or on iOS, a text. And while we are doing that, we can always have some other common functionality. We can ask if that control is empty, has no data. Is it required? Set the label so the control knows it's labeled. We'll look at that a little later. And there's a whole lot of other stuff that we can do that's common to every control. So we have the RDDControl class interface. And how many people here have used interfaces before? If you're not using interfaces, you're missing out on one of the benefits of using object-oriented programming. What an interface does is makes two things that are, let's say, both controls, look like a third thing, which is the interface. And so if I have a pop-up menu, which isn't a text field, but if I say they both conform to the RDD control interface, I can treat them both exactly the same. And Xojo, when you say this thing conforms to that interface, it'll fill in all the methods that you've defined in the interface in that object for you. And you just have to write all the code that does all of that. But you only have to do that once. Oh, one last thing. I actually had a couple of footnotes in this thing. The RDD prefixes on all these, everything I've used. And the reason is I would have used a namespace, except that Windows and container controls are not namespaceable for some reason. And I don't know why that is. So everything conforms to the same interface. So as far as the rest of the program is concerned, we only have one kind of control, which is an RDD control. Here are the main methods of an RDD control. Do clear, do edit. What do clear does is takes whatever data might be in the control and puts it back into it's empty. Do edit enables the control. Do mark would mark the label that is attached to the control. We'll talk about that. You'll notice that there's some things that are built in, like the set visible and enable. And the reason they're here is because sometimes you make your own control and it has to do all sorts of weird stuff to enable itself or make itself invisible or visible. Anyway, we'll continue. So, how this works. Xojo Windows and container controls maintain a list of their controls. And what we spend much of the insides of the code doing is simply looping through that list, finding RDD controls, and doing one of those methods on it. So everything's in a container control, in a container, which is called obviously an RDD container. And if I say I want to edit the container, which represents one table, it loops through, lines all the RDD controls, and says do edit to each of them. And now they're ready to edit. And that's what I just said. Okay, here we have some screens. It all looks more or less the same, except on the iPad version, we don't have pop-up menus, which we should. And I've sort of simulated it, and I can show you on here. They're all very similar. So that's, well, don't have to talk about that. I tend not to use radio buttons and checkboxes for the reasons on the screen. I do occasionally use a checkbox if the user needs to change the state of something that's not getting saved. In other words, if they suddenly need to see the inactive users or inactive rows or whatever it is, they can click a button, which is a checkbox sometimes, and then they can see whatever they need to see. But that kind of stuff is never stored. Okay. A control needs to know its database column, where it's going to put its data, what validation it needs, and its label. And columns and validation, we added two public properties to each RDD control. One is called RDD column, and one is called RDD valid, and that's what they look like. And Xojo has this really cool feature where you can add public properties to an object and then make them visible in the IDE, in the behavior section, and maybe even other sections. I haven't tried. Has anyone not used that feature? You've all used that, great. The container represents a table. And there are two public properties for the table, the container, RDD table and RDD key. And they're likely also visible in the IDE. And here are the main container methods. And they look kind of like the other ones because this gets called and it just loops through and calls the appropriate methods for each of the RDD controls. Okay, each control may have a label. It may not have a label, may have a label. And what we want to do is wire the label up to the control. And there didn't seem to be a natural way of doing this in Xojo, so I developed a naming convention. So everything has a 3-character prefix, which really reflects the name of the control, though I don't know that I really need that. So, for example, if you're taking the first name, it's text F name, and the label is LBL, L name, or F name. And the segment control for the building, the reason building is 1, 2, 3, 4 is I live in a condo, there are 4 buildings, and I was just using that as model data. So seg building, label building. So every control has a 3-character prefix, and to look for the label, we just do all this stuff. We look through, first we basically use 2 loops. First we look through the container control and collect all the labels into a dictionary, and then we look through, again, looking through all the RDD controls, and then we rip off the 3-character prefix from the name of the control, stick LBL on the front of it, and look in the dictionary and see if it's there. And if it's there, we say, here control, here's your label. And so in this project I'm working on, the lockout tagout, before I came down, I'm in Minneapolis when I'm not out and about like this, and I was up in way at the end of Long Island and working with one of my testers, which is often a useful thing to do side by side, and we had a label that really should be disappearing or enabling when something else happened, but it didn't have a control. It was kind of a little help label, but it needed to disappear with something else. And he said, Bob, why don't you just make another control and make it disappear with that? Well, that would work fine because a control doesn't have to have anything in the RDD column field, and if there's nothing in there, it never gets populated and it, never gets saved, so it worked fine. So that was a nice accident. All right, you want to validate things. So we have an entry being required, or an entry is correct, like a phone number looks like a phone number, or a zip code looks like a zip code. And the other one, and required fields look like this. And the whole reason of having a control know its label is so we can make the label red when there's some problem that the user needs to deal with. And so we can tell the control, do mark true, and it turns its label red. Currently, we can I have a class that is called RDD valid, and it knows how to validate phone numbers and US postal codes, and it knows about state abbreviations, and it knows about passwords and dates and email addresses, more or less. And the idea is you can put anything in there you want, and it's just a name in the RDD valid, and it's a property on the control. And if you need to add another thing, you go into the RDD valid, you add a thing to the case statement, and you add a method to deal with whatever validation rule you need to do. Or you could subclass it too, it doesn't matter. Okay, so that's basically the idea. What I wanted to do now, because I had been doing this kind of thing for a while, I wanted to make it cross-target. I wanted to make it so it runs on the web, so it runs on desktop, and iOS. The problem is the web doesn't work like the other things. They have there's no concept of global because the global is referring to everything and all the users at the same time. But they have a session object, and the session object is in effect the global object for a single interaction with the user. So what I did is I made a session module that shows up in the desktop and in the iOS app. And now all of these targets look the same from the inside, where you or I might be seeing. Right, so if I want to get hold of this, the database, I say session.db, and I now have the database. And that is regardless of what platform I'm on. Okay, let's build a screen. Now, let's see, I think I have to just do that. And you're here? Okay, so what we have here, this doesn't working. It doesn't like fuzz. All right. This is, excuse me, I can't see what I'm doing. Okay, what we have here is the iOS version of that screen that you saw. And these are all native Xojo controls. So this is an iOS text field. And what I want to do is select all of these. That's a Command A for those who can't see my fingers. And I will just simply copy that here. And then we'll go over to RDD desk and go to Demo and paste it in. But I can't paste it in because the desktop doesn't know about iOS objects. These are the RDD controls. Select all, copy, here's our paste. Did I hit it? Yeah, there we go. I can't guarantee this is going to work in the future, but it works now. And if we were to compile this, I actually have the container control already wired up, and it moves all of the everything. So here's the column that I had on the iOS app, and here it is here. And so we'll run the desktop version. And this is the demo thing we were just looking at. Say find, and I think I only have one person in here. I use names of presidents as temporary, test people because they're really obvious. And I'm on first name basis with them all. And they're all wired in, it's all connected up. And so we can, since I basically talked, that's the whole thing, that's the demonstration. And so we've got another 20 minutes or so. We could look at some code. Let's see what else is in the, we'll look at some code in a minute. How often do you think you need to copy stuff from iOS to desktop, though? It's probably not very often, but I actually needed to do it because of the project I'm working on with Lockout Tagout. It requires an iPad so that whoever's going to write the procedure takes the iPad out into the shop and collects the information here on this. And anyone interested, I can show you this afterwards. It doesn't project well. Well, so we were done with that pretty much, and the desktop version was pretty much done, except then it was decided that we really want to let the user edit the information that they've entered on the iPad on the desktop. So I had to reproduce 5 screens from the iPad onto the desktop. And that worked. Some of the controls I changed because we didn't have to create new stuff. Because the rule was you're not going to be able to add a new energy source. We want you to go out to the machine so you know where everything is. We're not going to require you to remember anything. You take the iPad out to the machine. That's the whole point. So it actually worked. The desktop app is where we generate the report that goes on near the machine and where we also store the data. And the reason we do that on a desktop app rather than here is that these things can walk away pretty easily. And a desktop is usually somewhere in somebody's office. And the other thing is that we're also going to make a web version. A small shop might have, 10 machines and 15 employees, and they don't need to be accessing stuff in the sky. But a safety consultant who maybe handles multiple shops or a place that has multiple locations might want to be able to get at this stuff from various areas. Oh, and the other reason we didn't make this a web app on here is that out in the shop, you can't guarantee Wi-Fi. There's giant machines out there that really suck up a Wi-Fi signal, and you just go behind this machine and there's nothing. So, laziness works. The moral of the story is you build a library of controls and classes and you reuse them all the time. So how many people, when they're doing stuff, have you subclassed all the controls? Subclass all the controls. I mean, you don't have to do it the way I did. I mean, this is a little fanatic in some ways. But if you subclass the controls, you can do what you want with them. And I'm literally doing exactly the same thing, being lazy, by being on all the platforms. And I mean, literally, I'm going between desktop platform, iOS, and web as soon as we get back. And we're going to be starting on the web version, and we'll be beta testing this starting next week. So are there questions? Anybody have anything? This is all, it was too fast. Nobody has any questions. Does anyone think this is a silly idea?
Why isn't it built in is the question.
Why didn't Xojo build this in? Yeah. I don't know that. Talk to Jeff. I just thought this was a good idea. And it really makes your life easy because, oh, let's go back and look at the code. Let's look at a piece of code so you can see how this, we're not going to step through it. We could, I suppose. So I have to push another button. And let's kill this. And I think, yeah, this is this is the insides of the container control. This is the RDD container, and there's all those methods on the. Is that an, oh, it's my glasses that are out of focus. Okay. Those are methods. Here's the do save method. Can people see that? No. Is that better? More? Is that good? Yeah. All right. So basically, we'll start at the top here, except it's not scrolling. Come on. Where are we? I can't see where we are. Okay. If there's no table defined, just bail because I don't know what we're doing here. And you certainly can put multiple containers in a window, and if you don't have a table in it, it's not going to try to save. That makes sense. And then I have a thing called an RDD row, and it requires a couple of three parameters, the name of the table and the name of the key. And those are grabbed from the properties that are in the IDE, and whether it's a new row or an existing row. And we know it's a new row or an existing row because if it's a new row, the user said, give me a new one. And if it's an existing row, the user had selected something from a list or from a find, and they said edit. And then we get the database, and if the database is happy, we go ahead and we loop through all the controls. Can we see that? That's near the bottom. So we loop through all the controls, and we say, hey, if it's an RDD control, grab it as an RDD control, get the column. If the column is empty, not empty, then we simply put into the row the name of the column and the value, because all the controls are exactly the same. We simply say get value, and it's a piece of text. And what that's doing is actually shoving it into a dictionary inside the row. And can we, all right. Oh, I see the problem. This is not going to work. We're going to make it smaller in a minute, if I can figure it out. Let's see. Will this work? Yeah. And then once we've got the row all populated, if it's in a transaction, we just call the save method. And if it's not in a transaction, we create a transaction and we do the save. And that's it. And inside the save method that's attached to the database, it says, hey, is this a new one? And if so, it calls the save insert method. And if it's an existing one, it calls the insert update method. And it basically takes all that stuff apart, builds the SQL statements on the fly, and populates all the little question marks and shoves it in. And so I don't have to touch that stuff anymore. Also, I don't write the SQL to populate the screen, because it can do it itself, because every control knows the column it's talking to. And so when I did that find routine and it came up with the name of the person and filled out stuff, I didn't write the SQL for that. The program wrote the SQL for that. Yes?
You said that one container is one table.
Right.
What do you do about a name and address block that has a state pop-up? Is that sort of pre-populated in some initialization step, or that's coming from a different table?
Well, two things. I don't do state pop-ups. I detest them, because Minnesota is the 5th M down. And the main problem, I just don't like them to be too long. But actually, that's a good, legitimate question, because we do have, for example, on this thing, the list of machines is a pop-up, because we want them to use a... So for a pop-up menu, there's the RDD pop-up. You can pass it a record set, and it will then populate itself. So when the machine description, I think it's whatever the first page is of that, comes up, it says load pop-up. And if I have to do that more than once, I'll create a specialized object for that, so I can use it in multiple places in the program. And it'll be in the app controls folder, and it would know how to load itself. What I do is, for the pop-up, there are two values it gets. The value you see and the value that effectively becomes the row tag, and that's the value that gets stored in the database. And the database is the database for the machine. The pop-up can get the data wherever it wants. It doesn't care. Does that help? Did it answer the question?
I guess. I mean, the point is, you're loading the pop-up before you're putting it in this container. Is that the point?
Yes, basically. It happens during the open event. Anything else?
List boxes?
Question?
List boxes?
List boxes, I haven't had a need to put list boxes on things except as a selection kind of thing. And so if you look at the screens for those, you'll see a list box over on the left. And for example, for this application, there's a list box for if you're a safety consultant handling a dozen shops, your dozen shops will be listed on the list box. It's not in the container that holds the data for the shop table. So you pick the list box, and it basically tells the window, I've got some information, here's the key that you need because it's in the row tag, and it basically tells the container, do read, here's the key. The container goes out and generates the SQL using that key and populates itself. So the list box isn't part of the container. It's handled basically the same way the pop-up menu is. Yeah, we can retire. Anything else?
So,
What? Yes.
sorry, adding and removing controls then or data from the database, is that with, so if I want to add more columns to the database, your structure doesn't help with that? Or
No. All right. So if we
modifying the database?
if you modify the database, you're going to have to modify the screen one way or another. But what all I do, let's pretend we have, we're trying to keep track of a shop. It's the shop table. And so I have the name of the shop, an address line, city, state, zip. And then customer calls up and say, we need a second line of address. Well, you go into the table, you say address 2, because it's part of the same address. It's not like multiple telephone numbers. It really belongs right there. And you go into the screen and you copy the field for address 1 and position it where you want. Give it a name, text address 2. It probably doesn't need a label. And then you stick in the property field for the RDD column, address 2, and you're done. Oh, also, make sure you reset the tab order.
Will it automatically create a column?
No, you got to muck about with the database yourself.
So it creates the database once.
Yeah, the table. In fact, the way I do these things is I generate the database in code when the data program first starts out. It goes out and says, is there a database where I'm expecting to find one? And if it's not there, it goes, make the database. And there's a class that makes databases.
And it makes the database from your field sets?
No, it makes a database from a bunch of typing. No, it doesn't read the screens. That's a clever idea, though.
That's the way I do it.
Your database generator reads the screens.
Not reads the screens, but it reads the properties that I've got assigned for a database, and it adds those properties to the database.
Ah, no, I have code that, I don't read my own code. My code doesn't read my own code. One of the reasons I do that way is that at the same time, like for our list of machines where we have a whole bunch of machines that we have to fill in that machine database because it's used in a pop-up menu, it does that too. And you couldn't put that in the field. I hadn't thought about doing it that way. Let's see here. We want to, any other questions? Oh, yeah, if you notice at the bottom here where the else is, that basically said something really bad happened. And I used to have a show user module, which just could be called anywhere, and every screen, every window had to have an error label. And I used to have the error labels at the bottom, and now I have them at the top, because typically the controls you use to say save are either a toolbar at the top or a menu, and the user's eyes are up near the top of the screen. But because I wanted to make this common between web and everything else, I got rid of almost all the modules. In other words, anything that could retain state is now a class that gets instantiated when it's needed. So it made life a little bit more awkward, but because everything works the same way, it's worth it. All right, I'm going to ask two questions. How many people are staying over tonight? Well, allegedly we're all going to have dinner together somewhere if we can find a place big enough, so I hope to see you there. How many people need software testers? Nobody? Because Daniel and Jane are really good and they could use the work. What? Jane's my daughter, and she's a ceramic artist and lives in Albuquerque at the moment with her husband. And I said, Jane, you want to do some software testing? Not knowing whether ceramic artists could do this kind of thing or not. And she comes up with really good descriptions and causes things to break. And that was, who's going to argue? And I get to pay my own daughter. And Daniel is the son of a friend of ours. I've known them for 40 years or so, and it turns out he's really, really good. And he's never done this before. Neither Jane or Daniel has ever done testing before. And he has not only found crashes, which one might expect, but he says, you know, Bob, might be better if this was over here because then the user wouldn't get confused by that. He's really thinking about it from the point of view of it being used. So if you need some software testers that are reasonably inexpensive, let me know. Anyway, that's it. I'm sorry, it's too short.
Okay.
Oh, wait, gotta, there's I broke the world. Okay. These are some of the things I use. Keyboard Maestro is really handy, and maybe I'll come back and I'll show you what I do with that. iMazing 2 lets you get at data on the iPhone or the iPad. So everything is stored in SQLite databases in these apps. And sometimes I want to grab the database from one place and stick it in another. Like I want to see what's on the database in the iPhone. You tell it that data sharing is okay. You've got to set up a plist, and then you can suck the database file right off the phone onto your desktop, double click it, up comes Valentina Studio, and you can look at the data. Let's go back to the code a minute.
What does Source Code Pro do?
Source Code Pro is the font. It's a monospaced font, so all the font, and it was designed for doing source code. It's really, really readable, and it's free. I think it's Adobe, actually. Oh, right here. So I like to do this. What I tapped there was Option Command /, and it puts it in, and then I go in and type in this stuff manually, and it's sort of like the end of the thing. If I put my glasses on, I could see something. Contain er. And the method is do save, and saves container, which is not particularly helpful, but that's what it does. And it doesn't have any parameters, and it doesn't return anything. And so that's a nifty thing that Keyboard Maestro helps with. And then I'll just save it. What did what just do? It filled, here, I'll just type it again. I'm holding down the Option key, the Command key, and now I hit the /, and it did that. It fills in, it gives you my template for top of, it's like a macro, but it'll control all sorts of things on your Macintosh. You can do all sorts of magic stuff.
Do you know, I use the IDE scripting to do the same.
Right.
And that works quite well because you can then do what ifs and things. If it hasn't got that field already, you can add it.
And I haven't bothered playing with the IDE scripting, but maybe I should.
Quite easy.
Okay.
So then you can test, you can say, okay, if that, maybe you've got a standard set of functions that you have at the beginning and end of the routine.
Mm-hmm.
You can test and say, are they already there? If they're not,
Put them in. Good. I like it.
So look at some of these other things in your favorite software.
What are we looking at?
Your favorite software that you had up there.
Oh, we have to go back to the other thing here.
Go back to that.
Okay, so Source Code Pro is the font. Keyboard Maestro is the thing that lets me do macros. Valentina Studio is a database tool, and I find it really, really convenient. I haven't got the new version yet, but the new version allegedly will let you use parameterized queries, and you can leave the question marks in. When I write a query, and it works, I say, well, that's great. I mean, sometimes I have to write queries manually and not from the container, because the container stuff now is really reliable, it just works. But sometimes if I'm doing a report for some reason, I have to write a query by hand, because that will grab stuff from all sorts of places. And it's often likely that they don't work the first time. And so I grab the query from Xojo and I paste it into Valentina Studio, or you can use whatever database tool you want. I just use that one because I find it really, really good. And I play with the query until I get it where and then I paste it back into Xojo. And then I test it in Xojo because who knows. BBEdit is a wonderful text editor. It's been around forever. And it's this indie publisher, and they deserve everybody's support. Oh, there's a free, you can use it for free. They used to have a free version called Text Wrangler, and they dropped that. So now they only have one product, and it's got a free version and a pro version. And iMazing 2 is the thing that lets you look at the insides of your iPhone. Or, yes?
you have to know if Keyboard Maestro works internally.
I have no idea.
Okay. So I've tried some other keyboard shortcut things and they won't work internally.
I have never tried it because I try to stay away from the terminal as much as possible because I'm afraid I'm going to wreck the Macintosh. Yes? Is everybody hearing the questions? I haven't been repeating them, but I haven't heard any problems with. So that was, does keyboard work in terminal? And the answer is, I don't know. Continue.
Do you use Valentina Studio for reports?
No, not yet. The question was, do I use Valentina Studio for reports? And the answer is, no, I don't. Yes?
The free version of Valentina or the pro version?
I think this might be the pro version. I think I bought it at one point. But there is a free version, and it does bunches of what you might want. The only thing it doesn't know about is encrypted SQLite databases. It gets really upset. It'll say, I don't think that's a database, and it goes away. Anything else? Well, I had a good time. I hope you guys did.